Alright, let's see how this goes. I've got the shaft back in here, the spring's in place. It turns smoothly in one direction, doesn't want to rotate at all in the other direction, which is absolutely as it should be. So, let's take our take-up spool, just run a little bit of synthetic grease in there, fit this into place. It should fit over that bush and it should drop down into the body without too much of a fight. Yeah, there it goes. Next, we've got our advance here. I'm going to pre-assemble some of this just to make it easier to get into position. So we have our drive dog, the piece that drives the take-up spool. And here's our advance shaft. Put the spring in there, drive dog in there, and that is retracted with our advance and retard lever here, which I'm putting in place temporarily. Let's rotate this into position, see if we can get that fed into the cassette, to the take-up spool rather. That feels okay. Let's get the spring out from underneath. Drop that down into place. Get one of our fixing screws in. Take that lever off now. That's nothing can fall to pieces. There are 3 screws in place. Check that the spool rotates. It does. Right, on here we have that plain disc, we have our ratchet wheel, that washer, this screws on here, the advance is nice and smooth. I'm just going to tighten that up. That's lovely. Doesn't want to turn in the reverse direction, that's just ideal. And this piece, our advance rewind lever, has to lift that little pawl out of the take-up spool, and so we'll just get that sorted out. So getting this started at the correct position is always the challenge. That's not far enough forward, we need to go back another notch. Try that. That's not either. That's not. Ooh. There. In that position, in the R position here, it's free to rewind. In the A position here, it's not free to rewind, it can only move forward. But even in the R position, you'll notice, even though the spool can be turned backwards to wind the film back into the cassette, the knob does not move. So you do not rewind the film by trying to turn this knob backwards. All your rewind action happens down at the rewind knob end. So that's just ideal, that position's just good there. However, we've got a lot more work to do on this camera, so I was mostly just interested in getting that part done, getting that broken spring, or the spring with its end bent out of shape back in position so that the knob will only rotate in the correct position and cannot be rotated in the other direction. And in the rewind position, the take-up spool will revolve backwards freely. So that part at least is good. I might do the rest of the top part of this camera. I can get the advanced parts in. I can't put the cover on until I've dealt with everything else, because we still need to lift out this struts mechanism when I get to that point. I'm getting ahead of myself here. I can't do the complete assembly of the film advance mechanism before I take the struts out, because I need to be able to remove a screw here in order to take the struts out. But at least I can do a test fit up of the film advance mechanism. So here basically what I'm doing is I'm just cleaning and lubricating the rewind shaft, and I've just cleaned that, put a bit of synthetic grease in there, pop that into position. See how smoothly that runs or otherwise. Seems okay. We'll put the rewind knob on there. Just check that will actually pull all the way up. Sometimes if these forks on the end here have been too distorted, this will not pull up out of the film cassette very well. I have to say this is not the smoothest running example I've ever seen. The forks look a little bit splayed. I'll give them a little nudge, I think, and see how that helps. Where's my nudging stick? There we go. Be very cautious with this. These are brass. They're not particularly strong. That whole bush is a bit tight there, I think. Let's remove that bush and see if we can get that to move smoother on the shaft. So that little tab might be a little bit too bent in. If that's not got a fair bit of bite to it, then the shaft tends to flap about like this. So it needs more than that. It may be that this whole piece here is out of round. That's certainly a possibility. Just checking what it's like. It seems to be okay at that end. A bit tighter at that end. I'll see if I can work on getting the tension of this piece here, this tab in place, better. But here, this is definitely binding up. Let's just pull that through. You're right at the end here, and there are marks on that shaft. It's a bit tight, so I think a little bit of file work there might be the answer. I'll have to look at this with a straight edge and see if those things are splayed or whether they're just damaged. Certainly splayed, and it's mostly this one. It's not quite so bad now. Let's see how that goes. Still tight. This should pull all the way back up to those stop positions effectively. That's what they're there for. I'm a bit reluctant to hit that anymore. I think I will try winding that up with a in the vise to bring those in a controlled manner. Well, an indecent amount of time was taken to get that to work correctly so that it's got some sort of detent, but that the rewind retracts all the way to allow you to get a film cassette in there easily. And it was just a bugger of a job. Every piece of metal involved there was slightly out of shape, so it was somewhat tricky getting that to behave itself, but it does now. Oh, didn't really have a close look at that back catch, did I, to see how it got on after the araldite. Looks like it's behaved well. Looking at the catch on the door end here, that does look like someone's modified that somewhat, probably not a lot. I'll put a touch of molybdenum paste on that tab. It is somewhat steeper than I'd expect that slope to be. And the back catch doesn't want to come all the way over it, so I suspect that that's needs a little bit more attention there. That's alright, we can deal with that. I'll give that a little bit of adjustment and I should be in business. Yeah, it is a little bit tired looking. That's better. It's alright if you do it manually, but you should be able to just press the thing back into place and have it drop over. Oh, that's snapping into position correctly now. That's better. So I think that's the answer there, but that was certainly a manufacturing defect. That end of that clip had been riveted over, but possibly a third of the formed head of the rivet, if you like, where it had been pinned over, had broken away. And so effectively it wasn't supported 360 degrees. It was only supported, what, probably at 250 degrees, something around that area. 240, I suppose. So it was moving. Anyway, that part's sorted out. I'm happy with the rewind. I'm happy with the advance. I've still got to deal with the mechanism here that latches the advance when it reaches the end of its stroke. And the tip on that is somewhat misshapen. I'm 50-50 on whether that will straighten out or whether that's just going to snap off and leave me with an engineering task. I suppose I better find out. Well, I have that advance mechanism together. I just really put it together so I could test the action. So if I roll the sprocket shaft forward with my thumb while I revolve the film advance, the latch drops in neatly. I press the lever, it releases the film advance and it latch drops in again. So I was able to reshape the end of that lever correctly. I haven't had to bend the lever at all. I thought that was quite a possibility. If you have to remove too much metal from the tip of that, you may have to bend the lever so that this cam will actually lift the lever or allow the lever to drop neatly into the ratchet, but it certainly appears to work quite well. You can see it drops in fairly snappily there. And as you press this lever, it turns this disc on the top, which lifts this cams that lever away, releasing the film advance and allowing you to wind on again. So these two discs, one driven by the sprocket shaft and the other one moved by this lever. One drives the other, but there's a slop in the mechanism because there's a pin in a slot there. It means that there's movement. So it drops into the notch, locks the film advance, you press this, it turns this top disc, which lifts that lever and frees up your film advance for the next shot. So the film advance is all working correctly now. So at least that part is out of the way. So there's been a few minor headaches with it, but fortunately everything's come out to the good. So at the end of the day now, tomorrow I'll have to take the leather off the base, remove the screw from here, 2 screws from in here, 1 from underneath, take out all the struts, take out the door, things of that nature, and just deal with the front of the camera and the shutter and lens assembly, then clean everything up and put the top cover back on. Here's the top cover here. It's in quite good condition for a camera of this age. If I was wanting to refinish something like this, spraying with automotive lacquer is probably the appropriate method. It's aluminium, this top housing. It won't take paint well. I don't know what's going on here. You can see there's a lot of mess around here. I hope that's just dried grease. So an etch primer first is required really with aluminium if you want the paint to stick. And baked finish would be the choice. And here, so this top part of the housing, that's the only piece that's really lost much paint. But it's hard to know where to start and stop if you want to start touching up paint on cameras. Really there's no easy place to decide where to start and stop with it. In most cases it's best not to start at all. Just decide that you've got a wounded soldier and he's got a few bandages on, but that's the way it's going to be. Right, that'll do for today. Well, I have the film advance components all reassembled on the camera now, and they all appear to be working well. So if I rotate the take-up spool and the sprocket wheel, I'm rotating with my thumb at the same time, you'll see that as the wheel here comes round to the notch, the arm will drop in and allows the pawl to drop in to the ratchet wheel here and locks the film advance. So the film advance is locking correctly now. That's all good. So if you press the release lever here, moves the frame counter 1 notch, shifts this top cam forward, which lifts this arm away, and of course also lifts the pawl out of the take-up spool and would allow you to wind on again. And there it is dropping in, ready for the next shot. So all those components are working correctly now, and I'm just going to remove a couple of these to get at the screw here which holds the struts in place. The rest of it can sit there at the moment assembled, I think. I don't think I need to take it back off the camera until I need to put the top cover back on, when of course I've got to remove my rewind advance lever at this end and the knobs as well. Right, so the next task here is to strip the leather off the base of the camera so I can get at the screw that's under there and remove the door, remove this so I can get at the screw which holds the struts and so forth in place, and remove those struts mechanisms. Right, to it. Just remove the depth of field dials from the bottom of the camera. Now typically there's a metal plate that sits on the top here, which is not present here. I certainly know it's there in the later models. I'm not 100% certain about the 118. That's interesting. It's not a major issue. So see if I can get this leather to lift. And I'll just turn this round so I can sort of see what I'm doing as I peel this up. If there's any serious delamination of the leather, I'll rethink my method, but otherwise I'll peel it off like this. You can see that we've got remains of some leather here, but that's just a very thin layer of leather fibres there. That's not a significant problem. We've got to be careful around this button because of course the leather is very narrow at that point. Right, there's our leather off in one piece. Looks tidy too. That should be an easy job to put back. At the base of the camera, well, very commonly tripod sockets are loose. This one, yeah, the screws are loose. I'll take that off and clean it, screw it back down tight. Tripod sockets were often like this on old cameras. They've got a very small bearing area, and that's because the sorts of tripods people used at that time often were spindly little things with a little ball and socket head on the top of them. They didn't have a big flat plate to mount the camera to. Okay, well that's that part. Let's remove this piece here. There should be a screw underneath there somewhere. There's my tweezers. Here's a pair that'll do for the moment. Oh, that screw there actually is the one that holds the struts in place. That's good to know. The front door, that can come off. A single hinge pin screw top and bottom. I'm just partially collapsing the front there. There's a strong spring on that door here which helps open it, and I put that rule down there so that it scraped along the rule and not the painted body edge, because I do not want to damage the paint any more than needed, which is typically you don't need to damage the paint at all. Right, so there's the door off the front. Now I've got to remove my lens and shutter assembly. Now, one of my tools will probably do this job better than another one, so I've got to choose wisely. I think that's on there. Let's give that a go. Certainly engaged. Probably rotating the shutter, is it? No, there we go. The retainer ring is coming loose. There's our lens and shutter assembly. Pop that to one side. Back to the body itself. So I need to mark my focus scale ring so that I know where it goes relative to the outer helical. Then I'll just scribe a line across it. Typically I just scribe 2 at the base and 1 at the top. That way I can see my alignment marks clearly. I also know which way up the inner and outer helical are assembled together. So I can remove the 4 screws that hold the focus scale ring to the outer helical. Just collecting up my parts from the bench top here and popping them in a container so they don't get lost. If you're not familiar with this task, then you're probably best advised to carefully lay them out in a way so you know where they actually come from. There's sand and grit under here. There's a lot of grit. 4 screws here, the smaller heads, hold the bellows to the back of the front standard, so I'll undo those, and the bellows will probably pull back into the body if they're not glued to the back. They're a bit sticky. Yeah, oh, that felt light trap is coming away. Let's just take that off and separate that later. It's in pieces, that's okay, it's not a terrible problem. 4 screws in the corners here will hold, let's just collapse these bellows so I can get a bit of pressure on these screws. 4 screws hold the focus assembly to the back of the front standard. Right, that can come out. Let's retrieve the screws from that focus mount. There's 3 there that held the bellows to the back of the front standard. I think there's one floating around loose. There it is. Okay. To this piece of felt, I've just got to glue that back together. Part of it's floating around here at the moment, waiting to be dealt to. The focus mount. Well, this way is up. I can tell this way is up because it's got a notch there. And that's so that when you press the release buttons at the top, they will only fall into the notch on the focus scale ring if it's at infinity. Right, so here I'm checking the alignment marks so that I can make sure I can get my inner and outer helical correctly positioned relative to each other later. Now someone has already scribed a line across here at the point where the inner and outer helical are at the same level. So I can rely on that mark. That's going to work well for me. This is very, very sticky. Yuck. It's very gooey. That's going to have to soak in the grease remover for a while, and the mount will all have to be cleaned too. Surprised that focus mount moved at all. So holding the bellows, the struts in place, well, there's 4 screws. One we've already removed from the top. There's one at the base. And there'll be 2 in the film cassette chamber. Now these screws often put up a fight. They usually haven't been disturbed in 60, 70 or 80 years. And they're often well stuck. Right, let's get these struts out. Here's our struts. And I can look at these. Well, they're a bit grimy. Certainly need a good clean. That's adhesive marks. No, it's oil. That yellow staining on here, that's oil. That's soaked out from the focus helical. I'm looking at the state of the struts to see if they're bent. The inner ones should be nice and flat. The outer ones should have a bit of a concave in them, so that when this is compressed in the body, it forces these pins upwards so that they latch into that front standard in the locked position. That all looks very good. Certainly no serious problem there. This piece of felt here, it's fairly well stuck. Let's just get that off that leather if I can. What's going on here? Okay, so a bit of imagination's going on here. That leather is actually underneath. That piece of felt is actually trapped underneath the leather at that point by the looks of it. Alright. I'll have to be a bit tidy, especially tidy when I glue all that back together. That's not as it should have been. That's interesting. That's an assembly fault. Now we already had an assembly fault here with that back catch, which now behaves itself. But obviously there was an assembly fault there too. So this is fairly early in the piece from the time that retinas were made. Perhaps they just weren't up to speed at that stage with their quality control. Very interesting indeed. Alright, so all this body I've got to clean. You probably see there's a bit of dust and dirt around there. I need to get all that rubbish out of there. Just get that nice and clean, that cavity. Likewise in the back of the camera. Got to make sure this is all clean. Most of this has been brushed out. That's just dust that's dropped back in while I've been opening the front up. So much for the body. We'll put that to one side. Now the helical. I've got a couple of options here. I think soaking that in degreaser for a while is certainly going to be a good choice. In fact, I might put it in the degreaser in the ultrasonic cleaner and give that a real birthday. This part I'll clean manually, just because I may want to leave that felt in place. Or may not. Might be easier to glue that back on the front of the bellows. It's some interesting looking adhesive there. That I can clean in the ultrasonic cleaner too, and the degreaser, in the grease remover, I think. Get all of that nice and clean, so that'll work nicely. Of course, there's not an awful lot more to this camera than what we see in front of us at the moment, except of course for the lens and shutter assembly, which I'll do last of all. Right, back once I've got these parts clean.